Ethan Carter had always believed that his property was more than just a plot of land. It was a living archive of his past, a testament to resilience, and a quiet retreat from a world that had too often been unkind. A decorated military veteran and a dedicated city official, Ethan had found solace after his years in service on a sprawling semi-rural homestead that boasted one particularly cherished structure, a time-worn barn. Built over a century ago by his grandfather, the barn's weathered wooden planks and iron trusses held memories of family gatherings, long summer evenings, and the promise of renewal. Restored painstakingly by Ethan himself, it was a symbol of hard work, honor, and the deep connection between generations. Every morning, as dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan would walk past the barn, feeling its silent strength. He often recalled the echoes of laughter and the gentle clatter of hay bales, reminders of a past that still nurtured his present. The barn wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary of history and identity, and it served as the backdrop to his passion for preserving what was authentic in a rapidly modernizing world. But in the quiet cul-de-sac of his community, a neighborhood governed not only by neighborly ties, but also by the Omnipotent Homeowners Association, HOA, not everyone saw beauty in history. Kerren, the self-appointed enforcer of community aesthetics and the current HOA president, prided herself on maintaining an image of perfection. With an air of entitlement and a knack for bending rules to suit her rigid ideals, Kerren had become infamous among the residents for her overreach. She ruled with a fine-toothed comb, demanding absolute conformity from homeowners and meting out fines with little regard for context or compassion. It wasn't long before Kerren's steely gaze fell upon Ethan's cherished barn. "It's an eyesore," she declared at a recent community gathering, her voice as sharp as the well-ironed uniform of an executive. To her, the barn's rustic charm was nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, an inconvenient distraction from the pristine image she envisioned for the neighborhood. Rumors quickly circulated that the structure was in violation of outdated zoning codes and aesthetic standards, even though no such infraction had ever been cited before. The first confrontation came on a crisp autumn morning. Ethan was inspecting the barn's weathered siding when a stern knock on his front door startled him. There, clad in a power suit and armed with a clipboard and a self-righteous glare, stood Kerren. In her hands was a final warning notice, an official document that demanded he either alter the barn's appearance to match the HOA's sterile guidelines or face steep penalties. "Ethan," Kerren intoned with practiced condescension, "this property is part of a community. Your barn disrupts the visual harmony of our neighborhood. You need to comply with our standards immediately." Ethan, who had always prided himself on knowing his rights and the historical significance of his property, regarded her with measured calm. "I understand you have guidelines, Kerren, but this barn is an important piece of my family's legacy. I've followed every code in our community for years without issue." Her lips curled into a dismissive smile as she retorted, "Your personal sentiment doesn't matter when it comes to the rules. The HOA rules are there for everyone." Though her tone was clipped and businesslike, Ethan sensed the simmering hubris beneath. It was not a mere regulatory matter. It was a battle between history and hubris, between the freedom to preserve one's heritage and an unyielding desire for conformity. Despite the tension, Ethan's first reaction was measured. He promised to review the notice and check the documents, trusting that his local legal expertise would soon set the record straight. Yet, as Kerren departed with a final pointed glance, he could not shake the feeling that this confrontation was the beginning of something far more insidious. The barn, a living monument of his past, was about to become the battleground for a larger conflict, a struggle between individual rights and the overzealous imposition of arbitrary standards. As Ethan re-entered his sanctuary, the rustling leaves and the creak of old would provided a bittersweet accompaniment to the dawning realization that sometimes preserving the past came with steep personal costs. Unbeknownst to him, Kerren's intrusion was only the opening move in a power play that would soon engulf not only his property, but the entire community. The stage was set, and both sides braced for a collision that would test loyalties, reveal hidden corruption, and redefine what it meant to call a place home. The morning after Kerren's visit brought with it an unexpected and ominous development. Ethan awoke to find, pinned to the weathered wooden door of his barn, a crisp envelope bearing the embossed seal of the HOA. Inside lay a fine, a staggering $750 penalty, for violating community aesthetics and failing to adhere to approved property modifications. The document was official in tone, listing obscure violations that Ethan was certain had never been mentioned before. The fine wasn't just a monetary hit. It was a direct challenge to his right to cherish his heritage. As he studied the notice, a chill ran down his spine. The language of the document was bureaucratic and cold, void of any personal consideration. Kerren's face flashed in his mind, a smug, unyielding mask that seemed to relish the power she wielded. Despite his confusion, Ethan knew that his years in public service had taught him one irrefutable truth. No law was above scrutiny, especially when it was enforced with such blatant disregard for justice. He decided to document every detail. Carefully, he snapped photos of the notice, recorded the envelope seal, and even made a note of the fine's reference number. Then, with a measured calm that belied the turmoil inside, he headed to the local zoning office. There he presented his case, citing local ordinances that had been in place long before the current HOA rules were drafted. The official he spoke with assured him that there was no record of a complaint regarding his barn, and that Kerren's newfound aggression might well be part of a broader pattern of overreach. Back home, Ethan couldn't help but feel that Kerren's actions were more than just a bureaucratic misstep. They were a power move designed to intimidate. Over the following days, he received additional communications. The HOA mailed him several more warnings, each more curt and impersonal than the last. Kerren herself began to make unscheduled visits, each time accompanied by a different board member who would silently inspect the property, nodding as if confirming some invisible standard of perfection. One afternoon, as Ethan was working in his makeshift barn workshop, restoring a piece of vintage farm equipment, there was a sudden knock at the door. Opening it, he found Kerren standing there, arms crossed, with a placid yet condescending smile. "Ethan, it seems you've been forgetting one simple rule. The rules apply to everyone, regardless of sentiment," she said, handing him another notice. This one warning him that failure to comply within 48 hours would result in further legal action. Ethan's temper flared, but he kept his voice even. "Kerren, I have every right to preserve my property the way it is. I've followed every guideline you claim to enforce, yet here I am being penalized for something that is part of my heritage." Her response was a thinly veiled threat. "Heritage is a nice word, Ethan, but it doesn't exempt you from community standards. If you want to live here, you must abide by them." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension. Over the next few days, the fine seemed to multiply, not in amount, but in its symbolic weight. Ethan received calls from local inspectors who had been dispatched to verify alleged violations. Each time he opened his door, he found more evidence of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. A note on his mailbox, a new letter in the mail slot, even an inspector lingering on his property with a clipboard and an expression of unwarranted scrutiny. In private moments, Ethan began to question whether this was simply a bureaucratic error or a deliberate ploy by Kerren to force him into submission. His experience as a city official had taught him that often, power was abused when left unchecked. He soon realized that the fines and warnings were less about preserving community aesthetics and more about establishing dominance, a way to keep dissenters in line. Ethan set about gathering evidence. Copies of every notice, detailed logs of inspector visits, and even recordings of Kerren's terse conversations with board members. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Kerren was pulling every string at her disposal to make an example out of him. In a community where appearances were everything, the HOA's first power move was not just a financial penalty. It was a declaration of war against anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Standing in the fading light of another contentious afternoon, Ethan looked out over his property and the proud silhouette of his barn. He knew that the battle was only beginning. The fine was a starting point, a calculated provocation designed to draw a line in the sand. And as the echoes of Kerren's threats lingered in the cooling air, Ethan vowed that he would not be cowed into erasing the legacy that the barn represented. As the days wore on, a pattern began to emerge that suggested the conflict was far from an isolated dispute. Ethan noticed whispers among his neighbors, quiet conversations exchanged over picket fences and in the shaded corners of the local diner. It wasn't long before he discovered that he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure from Kerren and her cronies. Several residents, who once smiled politely during HOA meetings, now exchanged furtive glances whenever the topic of compliance arose. Late one evening, as Ethan was poring over copies of the warning notices and fines in his study, a soft knock came at the door. Opening it, he found one of his longtime neighbors, Marjorie, a gentle soul known for her keen observational skills and unspoken support of tradition, whispering, "Ethan, you must know that Kerren isn't doing this in isolation. I've heard murmurs about secret donations to the HOA funds and how some fines mysteriously vanish when big names are involved." Her eyes darted nervously as she continued, "There's talk that the board is more interested in lining their own pockets than in maintaining our community." Ethan's pulse quickened. He'd always suspected that something was amiss behind Kerren's polished exterior. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he began a quiet investigation of his own. With the help of discreet conversations and a bit of old-fashioned neighborly camaraderie, Ethan started gathering evidence. He installed a few small cameras around the perimeter of his property, positions that caught not only the occasional unauthorized inspector, but also the furtive meetings between Kerren and a couple of board members late at night. Over the next several weeks, the evidence began to paint a damning picture. Ethan discovered that the fines levied against him were not unique. Other homeowners had been subtly bullied into compliance through similar tactics. In some cases, residents who had questioned the fines found themselves isolated by the community, their complaints dismissed as petty grievances. Even more damning was the financial trail that suggested funds collected by the HOA were not always used for the stated purpose of community upkeep. Rumors of Kerren siphoning off money to fund personal extravagances and unauthorized projects circulated like wildfire. Late one night, while reviewing footage from one of his cameras, Ethan caught a startling scene. Kerren herself, in what appeared to be a hushed conversation with a well-dressed board member, discussing adjustments to the fine schedule and referencing an unforeseen opportunity to push certain property owners to sell. The clip was short, but the implications were explosive. This was no longer about aesthetic disagreements. It was about corruption at the highest level of the HOA, and Ethan was suddenly at the center of it all. Armed with his evidence, Ethan started discreetly consulting with legal experts. He compiled a dossier of every irregularity, from the unexplained disappearance of fines to the anonymous tips that confirmed his suspicions of financial improprieties. Meanwhile, Kerren's actions grew ever more brazen. She began issuing warnings that hinted at eviction and even property seizure, claiming that any continued defiance of HOA guidelines would result in immediate and irreversible action. During one tense neighborhood meeting, an emergency session called at Kerren's insistence, Ethan stood up. With a file of printed evidence in hand, he challenged the board publicly. "I have documented numerous instances where our community's rules have been enforced arbitrarily and where funds appear to be misappropriated," he declared, his voice steady despite the tension. "This isn't about preserving a picturesque view. It's about power and corruption." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some residents looked down at their feet, while others exchanged glances of relief at the prospect of finally having their concerns acknowledged. Kerren's retort was swift and icy. "Your allegations are baseless, Ethan. You're simply trying to stir trouble," she snapped, her tone both patronizing and angry. But even as she spoke, a few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, a silent signal that perhaps not everyone was on board with her draconian methods. As the meeting adjourned in a cloud of uncertainty, Ethan couldn't help but feel that the HOA's grip was beginning to weaken. Yet, the battle was far from over. Kerren, feeling the pressure of dissent, doubled down on her tactics. Her next moves would test not only the strength of the community, but also Ethan's resolve to defend his heritage. and his right to preserve the barn that had long been a symbol of who he was. The conflict reached a fever pitch one crisp winter morning when Ethan awoke to an unsettling sight: a heavy-duty tow truck parked in front of his barn. Over the course of the night, contractors had been seen unloading equipment, and by sunrise, a section of the barn's old wiring had been forcibly disconnected. The HOA's rationale was chillingly bureaucratic. As a preemptive measure against potential fire hazards and structural decay, the HOA has initiated an immediate safety overhaul. But Ethan knew the truth. This was not about safety at all, but about intimidation and control. Frantic phone calls to the HOA were met with curt, rehearsed responses. Kerren's voice came through the line, crisp and devoid of empathy. "You've been given ample notice, Ethan. We're simply enforcing community standards." Outraged and determined, Ethan gathered every shred of documentation he had accumulated, the fines, the inspector logs, the camera footage, and prepared for the next step. He scheduled a meeting with a local attorney and compiled a portfolio of legal documents, zoning codes, and property records proving that not only was his barn compliant with local ordinances, but that the HOA had overstepped authority on multiple occasions. The next HOA meeting was set to be a public showdown. That evening, as community members filed into the town hall, tension buzzed in the air. The room was dimly lit, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. At the head of tables sat Kerren, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on Ethan with a mix of disdain and determination. When Ethan took the floor, he placed a thick file on the table, its contents laid out like a manifesto against tyranny. "I have here the official records that show this property, and particularly my barn, does not violate any community code," Ethan began, his voice steady. "Moreover, I have evidence that shows this safety overhaul is nothing more than an excuse to harass those who do not conform to arbitrary standards." His words rippled through the hall. Neighbors leaned forward, some with curious expressions, others with quiet nods of support. Kerren's face reddened, and she countered with the HOA's prepared statement: "Our actions are in the best interest of the community's safety and aesthetic." But as Ethan methodically presented the documents, local zoning laws, historical preservation guidelines, and even video clips of his property's condition, the room's mood shifted. A murmur of discontent rose among the residents, and even a couple of board members exchanged uneasy glances. Amid the mounting pressure, one of the board members, an older gentleman known for his even temperament, timidly asked if these documents prove that the barn meets all required standards. Then on what basis are these actions being taken? The question hung in the air, its silence a testament to the collective realization that something was deeply wrong. Kerren's response was weak, laced with desperation. "We have no choice. It's about preserving the overall look and feel of the neighborhood." But as Ethan continued his presentation, detailing not only the legal failings of the HOA's actions, but also the disturbing pattern of selective enforcement, the evidence was overwhelming. A wave of support swelled in the room. Neighbors began recounting their own grievances against the intrusive measures imposed by the HOA. In the midst of the heated debate, Ethan made a bold declaration: "I stand before you not only to defend my barn, but to reclaim our community from the grip of arbitrary rule. If we allow this level of overreach to continue, then we all lose what makes our homes unique." His words resonated, sparking a silent revolution among the assembled homeowners. Kerren, realizing that her control was unraveling, grew visibly agitated. As the meeting drew to a close, several residents approached Ethan, quietly at first, then with more confidence, voicing their support and demanding that the HOA's actions be re-evaluated. In that moment, the tide began to turn. The once feared HOA was now facing the united front of a community no longer willing to sacrifice its heritage on the altar of conformity. Outside the hall, in the cool night air, Ethan looked up at the starry sky and then back at his barn, its silhouette a defiant beacon against the dark. The public confrontation had not only exposed the illegitimacy of the HOA's power, but it also planted the seeds of a broader movement, a movement determined to preserve the history and individuality of every home in the neighborhood, no matter how imperfect. As the backlash against the HOA's heavy-handed tactics began to mount, Kerren's desperation turned palpable. In a final bid to regain control, she hatched a plan that would shock even the most jaded residents. Early one foggy morning, before most of the neighborhood had stirred, Kerren made an ominous call to the local police. Her claim was preposterous. Ethan's barn, she insisted, was a public disturbance and a safety hazard that endangered not only his property but the community as a whole. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived at Ethan's property. The officers, accustomed to Kerren's theatrics but still duty-bound, stepped out and began an investigation. Ethan, who had already anticipated such a move, calmly greeted the officers, flashing his city official badge as a sign of both respect for the law and confidence in its fairness. The situation escalated quickly. Kerren arrived on the scene, her face a mask of fury and panic, demanding that the police arrest Ethan for obstructing community safety and flouting proper protocol. However, as the officers began to inspect the barn and review the records Ethan had so meticulously gathered, their initial deference to Kerren waned. A young officer, after cross-referencing the local building codes and zoning laws with Ethan's documentation, remarked, "Sir, it appears this structure is fully compliant with all regulations." Kerren's face twisted in disbelief, her argument crumbling under the weight of official evidence. Unwilling to accept defeat, Kerren escalated her tactics further. Later that same day, she arranged for a private investigator, a man with a murky reputation, to shadow Ethan and dig up dirt that could be used to discredit him. Under cover of darkness, the PI attempted to break into Ethan's barn, hoping to find incriminating evidence or to plant false records that would justify further fines. Unbeknownst to Kerren, Ethan had already installed additional security cameras in strategic locations around his property. The next morning, while Kerren was busy briefing a select group of board members about her next course of action, Ethan played back the security footage at the next HOA meeting. The grainy video clearly showed the private investigator sneaking around the barn's perimeter, attempting to force open a side door. A hush fell over the room as the evidence was laid bare for all to see. For the first time, Kerren's underhanded maneuvers were exposed in vivid detail. Anger and disbelief rippled through the crowd. One resident burst out, "This is outrageous. We're being extorted and manipulated by someone who claims to protect our community." The video was undeniable, a stark visual of Kerren's final, desperate move to undermine Ethan and maintain her grip on power. Kerren's response was a mix of indignation and panic. "This is not what it looks like," she stammered, but her words fell flat amid the collective outrage. The board members, who had once supported her now, exchanged troubled looks. It was clear that Kerren's credibility was in tatters. Ethan, maintaining his calm, addressed the meeting one more time. "This isn't about my barn anymore," he said firmly. "It's about the abuse of power and the erosion of trust in our community institutions. We have all the right to protect our homes and our heritage from those who would exploit the rules for personal gain." With that declaration, the momentum shifted irrevocably. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence now found their voices, and the community united in demanding accountability. Kerren's desperate measures had backfired spectacularly, exposing her to both legal scrutiny and public contempt. The evidence of her illegal actions was overwhelming, and it was only a matter of time before law enforcement, along with independent auditors, would begin investigating the broader patterns of misconduct within the HOA. As Kerren left the meeting in a flurry of half-whispered apologies and frantic calls, the atmosphere in the room was electric with hope and vindication. For Ethan, the confrontation was deeply personal, a stand not just for his barn, but for the right of every homeowner to live without the shadow of tyranny. And though the battle was fierce, this latest twist had proven one thing: Kerren's days of unchecked power were numbered. In the days following Kerren's exposure, the winds of change swept through the community like a cleansing storm. The once impenetrable facade of the HOA began to crack as residents, emboldened by Ethan's courage and the undeniable evidence of corruption, rallied together. Petitions were signed. Local news outlets began to report on the scandal, and community meetings, once mere formalities, turned into impassioned assemblies where every voice was heard. At a special meeting convened by a coalition of outraged homeowners, the atmosphere was electric, with both righteous anger and a determination to reclaim control of their neighborhood. The board, now demoralized by internal dissent and external pressure, found itself divided. One by one, board members distanced themselves from Kerren's increasingly erratic behavior. A respected elder of the community, who had once been a silent onlooker, rose to speak. "We trusted the HOA to protect our interests, but instead it has become an instrument of oppression," he declared, his voice resonant with the wisdom of age and experience. Under mounting pressure, the city launched an independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Investigators uncovered a tangled web of irregularities, misallocated funds, forged documents, and a blatant disregard for the very rules meant to safeguard community interests. In public hearings, former board members admitted to being coerced by Kerren's iron-fisted tactics, and several even testified that they had been promised lucrative kickbacks in exchange for silence. In a dramatic vote that sent shockwaves through the community, the homeowners ultimately ousted Kerren from the HOA. With her removal came not only a formal declaration of her misconduct, but also an immediate freeze on all further fines and punitive actions against Ethan and his neighbors. The news spread quickly. Kerren's house was put on the market overnight, and local media captured images of her forlorn figure standing amid a backdrop of flashing cameras and the murmurs of vindicated residents. For Ethan, the victory was both bittersweet and profound. His barn, once the target of an arbitrary crusade, had become a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for those who believed that community should be built on trust, not tyranny. As he sat on his porch one cool morning, a cup of coffee warming his calloused hands, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The community had spoken, and Kerren's downfall was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law. Yet even in victory, Ethan remained vigilant. He continued to work with local officials to ensure that new bylaws would be enacted, ones that protected homeowners' rights and prevented the return of such authoritarian measures. Community leaders organized workshops on property rights and civic engagement, transforming the once claustrophobic atmosphere of the HOA into an open forum for discussion and progress. Meanwhile, Kerren's public humiliation only deepened. Invitations to neighborhood events dried up, her former allies distanced themselves, and the very rules she had championed were rewritten to ensure transparency and fairness. The collapse of the HOA's old guard served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power built on intimidation and deceit was doomed to fall. In the end, as the community began to rebuild with a newfound sense of unity, Ethan's victory transcended the mere defense of an old barn. It became a beacon for all who dared to stand up against the misuse of power. The echo of that decisive moment, of Kerren's last desperate move exposed and rejected, would resonate for years to come, a testament to the strength of a united people determined to preserve their heritage and dignity. In the aftermath of the public upheaval, legal proceedings swept through the remnants of the HOA like wildfire. The city's independent audit revealed systematic abuses of power and gross mismanagement of funds. With clear evidence in hand, several former board members, now cooperative witnesses, testified before local courts. A class action lawsuit was rapidly assembled, with Ethan and other affected homeowners at the forefront of the legal battle. The court's verdict was swift. The HOA was fined heavily for its misdeeds, and strict regulatory oversight was imposed to ensure that such abuses would never occur again. The once mighty institution was forced to dissolve, its assets redistributed among the community for improvements that directly benefited the residents. Ethan, who had acted as both whistleblower and community advocate, received commendations from local officials for his role in restoring transparency and fairness. In one final move, the state attorney general announced an investigation into the financial transactions overseen by Kerren's longtime lawyer, a man whose shady dealings had long been whispered about in hushed tones at neighborhood gatherings. The inquiry soon uncovered a trail of forged documents and misappropriated funds, leading to criminal charges against several key figures. The legal consequences were not just punitive but transformative. as new guidelines and checks were instituted to protect communities from future abuses. For many residents, this marked the end of a dark chapter, a turning point where justice had finally prevailed over arbitrary power. The legal collapse of the HOA not only vindicated those who had suffered under its rule, but also set a precedent for similar cases elsewhere. As the legal hammer fell, Kerren's personal world began to unravel. No longer shielded by her position within the HOA, she found herself isolated and discredited. Public humiliation was swift and unforgiving. Her personal assets were scrutinized, her reputation laid bare in local media, and the community turned its back on the once feared enforcer of rules. In the weeks following the scandal, Kerren's personal life suffered dramatic blows. Her car was repossessed after creditors, now aware of her financial mismanagement, moved in. Rumors spread that her marriage was on the brink, with whispers of infidelity and betrayal undermining her long-cherished image of control. At City Hall, she was seen arguing with officials who once deferred to her authority, her voice trembling with indignation and desperation. Then came the final twist. At a chance encounter at a community event, Ethan spotted Kerren working as an assistant property manager for a different HOA, a cruel irony that did not escape those who had witnessed her fall from grace. "I hope you like following the rules," Ethan remarked with a wry smile, the words laced with both triumph and poetic justice. In that moment, the neighborhood witnessed the full circle of retribution. A woman who once ruled with an iron fist, now forced to operate under the very system she had once manipulated. Kerren's personal downfall was not marked by dramatic violence or scandalous headlines, but by a slow, inevitable erosion of power, respect, and dignity. Each loss, her car, her reputation, her crumbling alliances, served as a lesson in the consequences of abusing authority. And as she faded from the public eye, her once feared presence became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that entitlement without accountability would always meet its match in a community determined to reclaim its freedom. The seasons changed, and with time, the neighborhood found its footing once more, a place where individuality and shared history were celebrated rather than suppressed. Ethan Carter, now a quiet local hero, spent his evenings on his porch, the silhouette of his barn a constant reminder of battles fought and won. Neighbors strolled by, greeting him warmly and sharing stories of how the community had transformed after the downfall of the oppressive HOA. At a festive block party held in the spring, laughter filled the air as residents reminisced about the days of needless fines and petty disputes. A mischievous young homeowner even jokingly presented Ethan with a novelty HOA violation notice for having too much historical charm. Ethan's eyes twinkled as he accepted the tongue-in-cheek gesture, replying with a wry, "They really did try." The party's atmosphere was one of liberation, a tangible sense of relief that the dark days of Kerren's rule were now a memory, replaced by a new era of community spirit and genuine accountability. Public meetings had become opportunities for open discussion rather than fear-fueled mandates, and the neighborhood had, in many ways, reinvented itself as a model of grassroots democracy. In a final nod to the past, Ethan decided to convert the barn into a community center, a space where local history, art, and dialogue could coexist in celebration of the very heritage that had once been threatened. As the first community event was held in the newly repurposed barn, residents marveled at how the building, once the target of Kerren's demands, had become the heart of their renewed spirit. And so, as dusk fell on that memorable day, Ethan sat back with a satisfied smile. His barn, once a battleground for entitlement, had found its new lease on life, not as a relic of defiance, but as a beacon of community pride. In the gentle glow of porch lights and the soft murmur of contented neighbors, it was clear that true power lay not in rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules, but in the freedom to preserve what truly mattered. Fade to black,